Hey nerds, just Jamie here with
your friend Claude.
And this is another episode of Nerd Bomber vs. Movies, the show where two movies fight and we pick a winner. Now, today's matchup is an interesting one. It's kind of mostly my pick.
Yep.
These are two of my sort of pet favorite movies. The matchup is The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension from 1984 and Big Trouble in Little China from 1986. The reason I chose these movies, I mean, there's kind of some connectivity between the two, but that's incidental to why I thought it would be a good idea. My main motivation for choosing these is just that they're both batshit crazy. They both seem like movies where any idea anybody had for them stuck. It's hard to believe. It's hard to believe that anything didn't make it on screen or that any idea was too far outside the box for these.
Right.
The secondary reason it's interesting that these two movies are matched up is that there is some interconnectivity. The director of Buckaroo Banzai, W.D. Richter, actually wrote Big Trouble in Little China. And I'll talk about that more as I do the basics, but that's just kind of an interesting connectivity because one of the longtime urban legends was that that Big Trouble in Little China started off as a sequel to Buckaroo Banzai and then was reworked into Big Trouble in Little China. Unfortunately, that's not true. As fun as that story is, it's not true.
Believable.
It is totally believable, especially when you watch them. But it's just kind of a little fun bit of trivia. So Those are my basic reasons. Any sort of first thoughts about these two movies? Because you're a little bit less familiar with them than I am.
Yeah, I had seen a Big Trouble in Little China for at least 10 years before we settled in to do this show, and it's been a couple for Buckaroo Banzai.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not generally the movies that I tend to gravitate towards, but they're sort of the kind that is, I'd say for me the connective tissue is that they both have that almost limitless bang for your buck. These are the kind of movies you can come back to over and over and see something new. So there's a lot of value here, I would say.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. They're both really fun, really interesting, really crazy movies. So that's it for the intro. In just a minute, I'm going to be back and give you the basics.
30 years ago, almost to this day, my mother and father gave their lives for what was then considered to be a very insane notion. The possibility of contacting alien life. Real live Martians were landing in Grover's Mill.
The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension. Rated PG.
Check newspapers for selected theaters.
All right, as I said, I'm here with the basics, and we're going to start with 1984's The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension, or usually it's just called Buckaroo Banzai. All right, so directing Buckaroo Banzai, we have W.D. Richter. He's mostly a writer, as I mentioned earlier. He actually wrote most of Big Trouble in Little China. He's not a writer on this film, though. His writing credits include Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Brubaker. It also includes Needful Things, and, as I mentioned, Big Trouble in Little China. That's what he's most known for. Writing this film, we have Earl McRauch. It might be Earl McRauch. I'm not really 100% sure on that. Not a lot of credits for him either, as a matter of fact. There's a few movies, this one being the most significant for our purposes, and there are a few novels, the novelization of this movie being the most significant for our purposes. Most of his career in Hollywood was as an uncredited script doctor. Doing the music for Buckaroo Banzai, we have Michael Bodiger. As a composer, he's most known for this film, also The Adventures of Milo and Otis, and a film called Bulletproof. All right, the cast for Buckaroo Banzai. This is where it gets kind of fun because it is quite a cast. It's really something, so we're going to dive in. First of all, playing the eponymous Buckaroo Banzai is Peter Weller. Now, Weller, of course, is most well known as the legendary RoboCop, but he has a lot of other credits in film and TV. He was actually the host of 2 seasons of a show called Engineering an Empire for the History Channel, and he has legit cred for that because he actually has a PhD in Italian Renaissance art history, and he got his bachelor's at Syracuse University, which is just up the road. All right, chewing the scenery as Dr. Emilio Lizardo / Lord John Wharfin is none other than John Lithgow. Lithgow can really do it all. He's done Broadway, he's done sitcoms, he's done action films like Cliffhanger with Sly Stallone, and he's done a lot of high-end TV more lately. He's a guy who's done a lot, so the list goes on and on. Playing Penny Pretty is Ellen Barkin. She's been in movies such as Eddie and the Cruisers, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Ocean's 13. More recently, she was in TNT's drama Animal Kingdom. Playing Dr. Sidney Zweibel / New Jersey is Jeff Goldblum, very well-known guy. We got Invasion of the Body Snatchers coming up again. We also have The Big Chill, The Fly, and of course we have Jurassic Park, Independence Day. He's also done a handful of Wes Anderson films, and he's actually been in the MCU as well, so Jeff Goldblum gets around. Next up, as John Big Botte, we have Christopher Lloyd. Of course, he's most well known as Doc Brown from the Back to the Future trilogy, but he also played Judge Doom in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. He was in the Addams Family films. He's also played a Klingon. He's done a ton of voice roles. He's just another iconic actor who has been and still is a very busy guy. Okay, so this film was written by Rausch thanks to the director Richter's wife having read Rausch's debut novel, Dirty Pictures from the Prom. She recommended that novel to her husband, Richter, and somewhere along the way, Rausch mentioned that he wanted to get into screenwriting, and Richter invited him to visit Warner Brothers, where Richter was already working as a script analyst for that production company. Over the next several years, this script saw several revisions, and the pair of Richter and Rausch saw several refusals until finally linking up with MGA UA to develop the film. But then you have the writer's strike, and that ended up putting this film back on the shelf. And then later down the line, they hooked up with 20th Century Fox, and then they actually got a budget, and they were actually able to go into production in September of 1983. All right, so pop culture footprint for Buckaroo Banzai. At the time that it came out, it was middling. The film did not do well with critics. There really wasn't a toy line or anything of that nature. It did get a couple of things at the time. Of course, it got the novelization, which is right here, because it was written by the same guy, Rausch. There was actually a series of Marvel comics, and there was a video game that was made for microcomputers, which we didn't have as much in this country, but you could play a version of Buckaroo Banzai on the Apple II, the Commodore 64, and the ZX Spectrum, and a couple others. More recently, the film has developed a strong cult fandom, of which I am a part. There's all kinds of merchandise available. There is a sequel novel that was again written by Rausch. The iconography of the character Buckaroo Banzai features prominently in the film Ready Player One. And TV series sequels / reboots have been in development twice, most recently with Kevin Smith, but neither of those things happened. So while there isn't any sign that the IP is currently up for any live action continuation, the brand may very well be strong enough for it to happen at some point, so we'll just have to see.
Remember the name Jack Burton.
Who? Jack Burton. Me. Where's Jack?
Jack!
Everybody relax, I'm here.
How are you gonna spring us?
I have no idea.
He's coming to rescue your summer.
Hey, what more can a guy ask for?
Big Trouble in Little China. Rated PG-13. Starts Wednesday, July 2nd at a theater near you.
All right, moving on to Big Trouble in Little China from 1986. Directing this movie, we have the legendary John Carpenter. He's a big-time, iconic, mostly cult movie director. Some of his stuff has broken through to the mainstream. Among many movies, the ones that people usually focus on are this one, The Thing, The Fog, Prince of Darkness, In the Mouth of Madness, Escapes from New York and LA. And of course, most of the Halloween franchise, especially the first half of it, he's responsible for. Writing credits here go to Gary Goldman and David Z. Weinstein. Giving them writing credits is a little cloudy, and you'll see why later. Goldman is known for this movie as well as Total Recall. Weinstein is known basically for this movie only. The script was largely overhauled by Buckaroo Banzai's director W.D. Richter, actually, and he gets adaptation credit for that. The music here was done, of course, by John Carpenter and Alan Howarth. Alan Howarth. Both known mostly for doing the music for Carpenter's movies. The cast. Another pretty good cast here. First of all, as Jack Burton, we have Kurt Russell. He's known for, again, Escapes from New York and LA. Also Tango and Cash, Tombstone, Stargate, many, many more. He's appeared in the MCU more recently as well. As lawyer Gracie Law, we have Kim Cattrall. She was in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, Mannequin, Police Academy early on. Of course, nowadays, she's most known for having played Samantha in Sex and the City. Playing Wayne Chi, that is, we have Dennis Dunn. Dunn is mostly known for this film, Year of the Dragon, Last Emperor. He was also in Carpenter's film, The Prince of Darkness, and several other movie and TV roles over the years. Playing the magical, mystical bad guy, David Lopan, we have James Hong. Hong has hundreds of credits to his name. He's said to be the most. He is said to have the most credits in the history of acting, essentially. So clearly, it's too many to mention. But I'll just say this: his first role was in 1954's Dragonfly Squadron, and his most recent role was in 2022's Everything Everywhere All at Once. So that's nearly a 70-year stretch, and he has projects that are currently in post-production. So he is setting some records, that James Hong there. Playing Egg Shen, we have Victor Wong. He is known for this film. Prince of Darkness comes up again. He's also known for Tremors, a great movie, and he was in the Joy Luck Club. Playing Miao Yin is Susie Pai. She's known mostly for this film, Sharky's Machine, and she appears in First Blood. All right, so in terms of production of this film, early versions of this script, as I mentioned earlier, were written, that is, by Goldman and Weinstein. They actually had this movie set in the 1880s, but when Richter was brought in to doctor the script by 20th Century Fox, he essentially rewrote the whole thing. Carpenter actually made a couple script changes based on budgetary limits and to strengthen the Gracie Law character, actually. Once that was done, the film was greenlit and went into production of October of 1985. The film was released less than a year later, so that was a pretty quick turnaround. The reason for that was they wanted to get this movie out ahead of another feature film that had the element of Chinese mysticism, and that was The Golden Child. And that's a movie that actually Carpenter turned down the opportunity to direct that film. Did Big Trouble in Little China instead and wanted to get his movie out first. All right, pop culture footprint for Big Trouble in Little China. It's kind of the same story as Buckaroo Banzai, actually. It might have had slightly better, but still mixed critical reviews. In terms of other media and merchandise at the time, not much. This film had no novels, no comics, no toys. There was a video game, and this one was kind of similar type systems. You could get this for the Amstrad, the C64, the ZX Spectrum, etc. More recently, the movie has developed a very strong fandom. Again, I'm part of this one too. There have been many home video, DVD, Blu-ray releases. There's been reaction toys, Funko Pops, there's a board game, there's a card game. There's actually several lines of ongoing comics from Boom Studios, and sequels have been rumored over the years, most recently in 2018, that is. But nothing further has been mentioned since then, so we'll have to see if anything becomes of the continuations of either of these franchises. Maybe, maybe not. All right, that's it for the basics. I'm going to step away, and Claude's going to be back with the tail of the tape.
Greetings, fight fans and movie buffs. I'm your friend Claude here with tonight's Tale of the Tape for our main event of the evening. Between the adventures of Buckaroo Banzai across the 8th dimension and Big Trouble in Little China. Perhaps as no surprise, we're starting off with the studios that put these movies out into the world. And right out of the gate, they are evenly matched because maybe for the first time in show history, I'm not entirely sure. If you want some extra interactivity, go back and look, see if this claim is accurate. But these movies were both put out by 20th Century Fox. Moving on to the rating, slightly different. Buckaroo Banzai comes in with PG, and Big Trouble in Little China is PG-13. Running time, they're still almost pretty evenly matched. Buckaroo Banzai comes in at 102 minutes, while Big Trouble in Little China is 99 minutes. Big 3-minute difference there. And as I said in the intro, you definitely get a lot of value packed into those minutes of screen time. The release dates for both movies continue to be kind of even. They're both right in the smack in the middle of summer. August 10th of 1984 for Buckaroo Banzai, and July 2nd of 1986 for Big Trouble in Little China. I mean, these were positioned and had all the makings on paper of being that kind of typical summer blockbuster, very effects heavy, lots going on. For whatever reason, as we move into the finances, you'll see that it didn't quite happen. Both had fairly modest budgets. Buckaroo Banzai, $17 million. And 2 years later, Big Trouble in Little China was made for between $19 and $25 million. You could, I guess, estimate 22 in the middle of there. Not terribly far apart. When you go down to what they brought in at the box office, though, both, unfortunately, are financial flops. Buckaroo Banzai, on their $17 million budget, brought in $6.3 million. About a third. And, maybe that plays into why the IP is kind of dormant, as was mentioned in the basics. Looking over at Big Trouble in Little China, on the $22-ish million budget, it made about half that, just over $11 million. Again, not a win, not a success, and certainly not a smash. But it's easy to see that both films have transcended their meager box office, at least initially, over the last nearly 40 years of consistent cult followings, home video rentals, sales, just projects that reference them. I mean, these are both what you would call probably elite cult movies. And that doesn't help anybody's pockets in 1984 and 86, but I don't think these things are going anywhere anytime soon. So, this is how they compare. Now let's open the doors and settle some scores.
All right, we're back and it's time to score. We're going to start with visuals, and we are going to start with The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension. And I will go first. I'm giving the visuals for that movie a 7.5. Very good, well above good, as a matter of fact. There's a couple different things here that I give it a 7.5 for. I think it represents the real world in a better way than Big Trouble in Little China does. So it gets a little bit of a bump for that. But it gets a little bit of a downgrade because when it tries to extend into the fantastic, it isn't quite able to achieve at the same type of level as the other film. So 7.5. And the third aspect of this film is that you simply have a director who is competent but not as skilled or as able to present things in an interesting way as John Carpenter is. So I don't want to keep disparaging it because I can see what's coming with the Big Trouble in Little China scores. But I'm giving it a good score, 7.5. Now pass it to you.
That's a very respectable score. I only go a half a notch below that at 7, and I pretty much agree with all your points. I would say that it is impressive, given the smaller budget and the large cast and the large ambitions of the story and of just kind of the it just seems like what they take resources that are clearly limited and they're just trying to do a lot with them. So I think they succeed more than they fail. Especially visually. It's clear more so in Buckaroo Banzai that they were limited in what they could do. But I think that they were still very creative and clever with pulling that off. And they managed to make alien technology seem truly alien in a more unique way than a lot of movies do, with much more money to spend.
Yes.
So I mean, that's another big part of why I gave it a 7. So yeah, just the way they made use of what they had. Yeah, it's above good for me. 7 for Buckaroo Banzai visuals.
All right, so now we'll do the visuals for Big Trouble in Little China. And again, perhaps it's the matchup. We try to be objective, but perhaps it's the matchup. When you're going up against a movie like this, it's hard to measure up. So my visual score for Big Trouble in Little China is the highest visual score I've given on the show. And we've had some good movies with some impressive visuals on the show, but sure. I'm going 9.5. Right to the top of the scale. I don't know if 10 is possible, because you're talking about perfection. So 10 is on the scale, but I don't know if it's achievable. Maybe we'll get there someday, but 9.5 is as high as I've gone. I think that this movie accomplishes everything it set out to accomplish visually to the maximum effect of the technology available at the time.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Sure, could we do something now with modern technology that might look better? I mean, sure, maybe. But this movie got maximum effectiveness out of what they had to work with. You have special effects makeup.
Yep.
You have some animatronic puppetry. You have a monster suit.
Yeah.
You have optical animated effects. You've got good set pieces. Yeah. Especially when they are sort of in Lo Pan's lair rescuing the girls. You just have one sort of set piece after another. It almost works like video game levels. Yep. You know, you have like the warehouse level, and then the sewer level, and then the underwater level. Yeah. Nobody likes an underwater level. But even then, you know, they dive into the water, and there's these skeletons and things like that. And then when they're down in the sewer later, when it's, you know, Jack and Egg, Shen and Wang and like their crew of, you know, I don't know, their team, I guess.
Ninja mercenaries,
Chinese Delta Force, I don't know. But so they're down in the sewers, and even like the set looks cool.
Yeah.
Like, it's not that it looks real, but it looks interesting. And in that way, it fits into this movie. It doesn't have to look like they actually climbed down into the sewer and hauled their cameras down there.
Right.
Like, it fits what they're doing. It's this, like, fantasy sewer.
Yeah.
And then you have, like, the floating eyeball monster, and you have the big hairy Bigfoot monster. You have a Lo Pan himself. You have old age makeup on James Hong. You've got, you know, the thunder, lightning, and rain.
Yeah.
So you guys got, and then okay, so that's just all mostly special effects I'm talking.
Yep.
Special effects, I talked about set pieces, but then you have like martial arts action. So I don't know if that fits into the visuals, but it's well shot. You have like martial arts fights. You have a big, you know, 18-wheeler. Well, I guess it's not an 18-wheeler because it doesn't have a trailer. But, you know, you have the semi-truck. There's just so much going on, and all of this is done on, for the time, a sort of mid-range budget.
Yeah.
But I think the key to it is, and I think this is maybe the biggest difference between these two movies. And so you're putting it in the hands of a very skilled filmmaker who knows how to squeeze a lot out of a little. And when he made this movie, he wasn't starting with a little.
Right.
He was starting with more. And he gets a lot out of it. So, and even sort of like the clothes that they're wearing, the costuming, even when it's not a big ape monster or anything, just like Jack Burton has ridiculous knee-high moccasins, and he's got the tank top, and, you know, the three Storms have their, you know, they all are, obviously they influenced Raiden from Mortal Kombat. I won't hear any different. You just have so much going on visually. The movie is never at a shortage of giving you something to look at. So it's getting my highest visual score of the show so far, 9.5.
I only go 1 point less, 8.5. This is, I mean, it's every high visual marks for every reason you said and more. I guess the things that stick out to me were not only in the scope of, you know, what they achieved, the variety of effects, but also in the actual execution. Because, you know, you have these optical and you have these animated, you know, lightning bolts or explosions, whatever, the phasing through the wall effect, those kinds of moments.
Yes.
And
Lo Pan's eyeball, mouth, shining power.
It's I don't know if it's a result of the copy, I guess, that we were watching, having been remastered or restored in some way, but I noticed that none of them seem to have the drawbacks of the time period. Lightning was like crisp. And,
Yes.
And it almost looked like, I mean, except for the way it behaved and moved, it almost looked like it had been done with a computer. Because it was just very believable.
Yes.
And the same kind of for all that stuff. There wasn't some of the phasing effects. You could tell it was like done by hand, but there wasn't the heavy, black outlines that you would see in a lot of other movies at the time.
Right.
So that kind of struck me. And again, maybe that's a restored thing, but if it's not, I mean, it's still impressive either way. But I mean, that's just another reason it's so impressive. I also think, and I'm a big kind of person for costuming, and this movie knocks it out of the park. I mean, you said, like, just in variety, Jack Burton has a bunch of wardrobe changes.
Yeah.
But so does everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost, as the movie progresses, the intensity of the wardrobe progresses with it, like elevates with it.
That's a good point.
I don't know if that was by design. I kind of feel like it had to be.
Yeah.
But what really struck me were the two female characters, the Lopan's captives with the green eyes.
Yes.
Once they get them together finally, it's just an endless stream of just increasingly ornate dresses and headpieces.
Yeah.
And on this show, one of the highest marks I've given out for that same approach was Flash Gordon.
Mm-hmm.
And this, as much as that impressed me, this equally kind of was right there for me.
Saying something.
Don't come for me if I didn't score this as high as I did Flash Gordon. Because Flash Gordon is kind of wall to wall with that stuff,
Yes.
whereas there's moments of normality in this.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, those are the things visually that really stood out to me. So I feel like 8.5 is really strong as well.
Sure is. All right, time for round two. That's going to be performances. This time Claude's up first.
Well, my performance score, we'll start with Buckaroo Banzai, as we should.
Table's about to get flipped.
I go just below good. I go 5.5. It's not that anybody is particularly bad. I think that because some of the factors we mentioned in the visual category, the less experienced director, the stretching of resources, and maybe that extended to just what they were able to capture, time constraints, things like that. Maybe it created other challenges and obstacles. But for whatever reason, for me, while the performances in this movie are memorable and quirky and unique and several other good qualities, I don't come away from this with anybody just living in my head rent-free, so to speak. I don't, for me, actually, the performance that stands out the most is Christopher Lloyd's. And I almost think that's just because that's who he is. Watch any other movie. Obviously Back to the Future. Watch fucking Suburban Commando.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
He does it no matter where you put it.
My favorite Martian.
Right. I forgot he did that.
That's
right. So, I don't know that I can necessarily allow Christopher Lloyd to be the tide that raises all ships in terms of how I score the performances. When you're watching a movie, they work well, and they serve the story, and they do what they're supposed to do, and they are, again, unique. They are enjoyable, but I once the movie's over, there's no real impact left on me. So I go right below good. I go 5.5. Tell me why I'm wrong.
Which is 5.5 is still competent, I guess. This is maybe the widest gulf we've had between two scores, because I'm going way up.
I think so.
And I'm going 9 for performances on Buckaroo Banzai. Now, you mentioned Christopher Lloyd. That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
He's chewing scenery, I think, in the best possible way, in a way that only Christopher Lloyd can. However, he has a tag team partner, and that is John Lithgow, also chewing a lot of scenery as Emilio Lizardo / John Worfen. Mm-hmm. You have the sort of over-the-top big performances of John Lithgow and Christopher Lloyd. they are both villains, although they are antagonistic against each other as well.
Yeah.
And then on the opposite side of that, your antagonist is the character Buckaroo Banzai, played by Peter Weller in a way that Peter Weller would play a character like that. So Peter Weller is also doing what he does.
That's true.
And that is being sort of like very calm and under control at all times.
Yep.
He is, I think Peter Weller's performance in this movie is overlooked because I think he's being sort of the straight man. He's being serious and straight-laced. But there is sort of like a wryness to it. But I also think it helps balance the whole movie. So those three are a big boost across the board. Everyone else is doing their job very well. In some ways, you have Jeff Goldblum. He's also a very quirky guy.
That's true.
And he's also in there playing a very quirky character, but he's doing it in his very Jeff Goldblum way. You know, like he plays low-key quirky. So again, you have this seesaw. And you have big and you have small, but somehow it balances. So I think that that's all very well pulled off. And I think that these actors are working with material that is way outside the box and still managing to make it work. In some cases against type, in some cases very much with type. So again, very high score for me. 9, the biggest gulf between two scores we've ever had.
True. As for the performances in Big Trouble in Little China, I give that a 7. And I think that part of it, perhaps, is that the nature of the performances in this movie are the kind that just appeal to me more. I guess that's why this whole thing is subjective, huh? But beyond that, I think the overall amount of just quirkiness and elements about characters that make them really interesting are spread out more in this movie. And found my attention and interest just bouncing more between cast members. It seemed like they kind of all brought something really unique and fun to analyze, I guess, to the table a little more. And I will say, though, one of the things that limits this to a 7, and again, we'll get into this more in writing, but is the way that some of the characters were pulling double and triple duty. So they had to sort of work that into their performances, perform as this character, but also perform as, you know, giving the audience exposition, giving the audience narration. And some of that is a little unbalanced, for me anyway. And especially in the beginning of the movie, obviously the beginning is when you kind of set the stage and give all the information you'll need later on. But to see the actors sort of almost forcing that into their performance kind of took me out a little bit. And I thought it was just a really noticeable choice. And I didn't think of them as characters in the movie while that was going on. I thought, oh, okay, they're performing a function now. So while I think that there's a lot going on, and I think that there's a lot that they do very well, and it is very interesting and fun. Some of the ways they were used otherwise kind of just put a ceiling on it for me. So again, performances for Big Trouble in Little China are 7 from me.
All right, so I'm going up. We are pretty separate on this one too, not quite as different as the others, as the acting in the other movie. For this, for Big Trouble in Little China, I'm going 8.5 for performances. So I'm going above your score for Big Trouble in Little China, but I'm going actually below my score for Buckaroo Banzai here. 8.5, still obviously very good, and for all the reasons that you mentioned. I think that the only thing that that's a knock against it is that it doesn't have sort of to me, it doesn't have as memorable performance as what I see in Buckaroo Banzai. I think the one that sticks with me from this movie most often is probably the character David Lopan. Is the thing that sticks with me the most. Not because, I mean, it is a little bit of a big performance, even though like it's physically very small performance in a lot of ways. Like when he's old man David Lopan, he barely moves because he's in the wheelchair. He's very old, but he has he's doing this vocal stuff and this weird performance. When he's mystical David Lopan, he's 10 feet tall.
Right.
And he's very regal looking, and it's cool, like, design and everything, but he's still not doing a big performance.
No.
But he's still doing a weird performance. So in some ways, that's overall, like, that's what sticks with me from this movie. Everybody else is pretty standard in their type. The character of Egg Shen is kind of like the wise, older, mystical guy.
Mm-hmm.
I like Kim Cattrall in this movie, but she does struggle with some of the line deliveries. Like, and I think she's making a lot of these choices where she's talking like she's out of the 1930s. And I don't think it quite lands for me.
I don't disagree.
Yeah, so that's a little bit funky for me. Again, it obviously doesn't hurt the score. I'm giving it this movie an 8.5. I mean, I'm trying to point out the reasons why maybe it doesn't rise to the level of Buckaroo Banzai. 8.5 in any other context is a very good score. And then, of course, so I should focus on the main protagonist, Jack Burton, Kurt Russell.
Or is he?
Or is he? We'll talk about that in a little bit. This is a very fun performance from him. He's got like a John Wayne thing going on. Like you mentioned that kind of later in the movie.
Yeah.
He's kind of been doing that the whole time. And then we'll get into more of why his performance, what he does is very tied into what the movie is trying to do and say. So
right.
I think we'll get into more of that later. But again, he does a really good job. I think you also have the character of Wang, played by Dennis Dunn. That's very straightforward hero stuff. His character, he knows what's going on, and he's extraordinarily competent. I don't think he ever really fails in anything he tries to do.
Yeah.
So in that way, he's kind of very, he's kind of the he's white meat babyface here in this movie. That's a wrestling term in case you don't know. He's just kind of like the standard, in a lot of ways, the standard good guy.
Right.
Jack Burton is more of a Han Solo, a scruffy looking nerf herder type of character. So, but I think he pulls it off well, and we'll talk about more of the sort of details of that later on. But, so that's really good. The character of Egg Shen's really good. The character of Wang's really good. I'm not saying great here at all.
Right.
Really good, really good, really good. Lopan, that's a pretty great performance. So, to me, that comes to an 8.5. So pretty good score for me. You gave it a 7, I gave it an 8.5. All right, so round 3, writing. Some more wide differences of opinion here. Again, starting with Buckaroo Banzai, I'm going 8 for writing. Both of these movies are starting off at a high point because of their ambitions. It's kind of amazing that either of these movies got greenlit for what they were.
That is true.
Especially at that time when Hollywood was mostly dominated by like sort of straightforward action movies, rom-coms, and and a lot of sort of like the gross out comedy type stuff.
Yep. Also featuring Kim Cattrall.
Yes, in several cases, as I mentioned earlier. But this movie does something a little bit different. Both of these movies do, but this one especially, I think, actually. This one actually probably has, I don't know that it's more ambitious, but it definitely has more ingredients in the stew.
Yeah.
Because you've got, first of all, as I mentioned earlier with Buckaroo Banzai, his character alone has all these different facets to him.
Yeah.
He's rocket scientist, brain surgeon, rock star, superhero.
That's 4 movies by itself.
And then you have like the Blue Blazer regulars, I guess, because you have, so Buckaroo Banzai and the Hong Kong Cavaliers, which is his band,
Right.
They have this whole international following of fans that are ready to jump into physical action for them in their heroic functions at any given time, including minors, by the way. So, but then you also have one of the bad guys who's actually an alien.
Yep.
Is Emilio Lizardo / John Worfen. So he's one of the bad guy aliens, and he's also sort of like a professor, but he's in an asylum. And then you have the other bad guy, John Big Boutte, has his own sort of personality going on. So like, we're going to plug in all these different personalities for everybody, and these different backgrounds for everybody, and we're going to have aliens, and we're going to have interdimensional travel, and we're going to have all of these things. It's tough to hold all that together. I think the movie does a pretty okay job of it. I know you're probably going to disagree about that in a couple minutes here, but
we'll see.
I'm giving it an 8. Also, I think it does have at least one very memorable line. Arguably, the exact wording of this line comes from this movie, and that's "wherever you go, there you are."
Yep.
And there's some argument about exactly where that phrase comes from, but those words put in that order often gets credited to this movie. So you like to talk about iconic quotes, and this movie has one, damn it.
And you stole it from me. So I'm not going to talk about it at all.
All right, so yeah, my score, I'm giving it an 8 for writing. Claude, why don't you tell us what you got?
My writing score for Buckaroo Banzai is less than what you gave it. 3 points less, in fact. I'm going 5. You take good, you drop it down a point. Because as I do this remainder of this round by myself, I'll explain that, again, it's a function of the chaotic nature of the story they're telling. It's projects like that are tough. There's longevity here in terms of pop culture for a reason, but I also think that there's financial failure in the immediate release era of this movie for a reason. And I'm sure it doesn't all come down to writing, but for me, it's hard to follow when you're spinning that many plates or when you have that many ingredients in the stew, as you said.
I like to create new metaphors.
Yes. I see its merits. I see what it's trying to do, and I just feel like it doesn't quite hit it for me. There's a point where I guess I'm almost overwhelmed by some of what is happening. Some of the weavings of this narrative with as you said, the main character, the central protagonist himself, is 4 different types of character. So that's where you're starting. And again, kudos for ambition. That's 5 points. But yeah, it's at a point for me, it starts being interesting and starts to be almost, I guess I just tune out. My review for this movie is much like what I perceive the script for the movie to be itself. A chaotic mishmash of conflicting thoughts and ideas that may or may not work out in the end. And for that reason, I give the writing in Buckaroo Banzai 5.
Alrighty, so we're going to move on to Big Trouble in Little China, and we're going to disagree again. It's maybe the last episode of this show. So when we're done, I'm going to storm out of here. I'm hot.
Stay tuned.
So I'm going even higher for my writing score for Big Trouble in Little China. I'm going 9. It gets a better score for because of some of the factors you talk about, where it's just a little bit simpler.
Yeah.
It's just a little bit more streamlined.
Right.
You have your primary protagonist is, as I said, he's kind of like the scruffy good guy archetype.
Yep.
The secondary protagonist is sort of the straightforward heroic. Mm-hmm. You've got the old mystical man. You got the evil old mystical man. And you've got a couple heroines / damsels in distress / not really damsels in distress. This movie passes the Bechdel test. So take that for what you will. It still has a lot of obviously weird elements, because you take that normality of like your hero, and then you all of a sudden you're in magical Chinese dungeons under San Francisco, where a 90-year-old man / his living ghost form are going to marry. and by the way, there's, as I already said, like there's monsters and floating eyeball creatures, and there's all kinds of giant ant things coming out of walls. The black blood of the earth is flowing through the magical underground San Francisco sewer. So there's a lot going on with this movie. But one thing, I think it balances all that well, and I think that I don't mind the expository nature of some of the dialogue as much as you seem to from your earlier, when you were talking about how that sort of maybe hurts performances when characters have to handle that sort of thing.
Right.
Because we might talk more about this later when we're just sort of like, rambling about the movies. But, there's this thing about how Jack Burton might not actually be the primary protagonist of this movie, because he's a little bit of a bumbling sidekick, actually. Very willing, very good-hearted, just kind of like doesn't really hit for a good average in terms of capability. But there is this other thing going on where like part of the reason he's there is because he has to ask Shen, like, what's going on, Shen? Right. So Shen can explain it to him.
Right.
So now we know.
Yep.
So I mean I think that's a little bit better way of doing it than at least somebody's asking for the information. And Shen's just not like, it's just not part of how he talks.
Yeah.
It's like, it's not, I don't walk in there and say, hey, Claude, who works at the local college and does a YouTube show, and we used to do a podcast. You know what I mean? Like, that would be sort of, to me, they do it better when someone says, hey, what's Claude up to? And somebody tells somebody that.
Right.
It's a little bit more effective. So I don't have a problem with that part of it. The last thing I'm going to talk about with writing is something that you mentioned earlier, how things kind of ramp up throughout the movie. Mm-hmm. You know, you start off, they give a little hint of it because when Egg Shen's talking to like the investigator or whatever, he gives you the little lightning powers. But then they go to Jack Burton doing his little, you know, CB radio show as he drives down, you know, on a dark and stormy night. So the very first sort of action scene is a microcosm of what the movie is.
True.
These like Chinese gangs come out, but instead of having a big martial arts fight, it just starts off as like a typical action movie gunfight.
Yep.
And Burton and Wang are just sitting in the truck, stuck in the alley watching this. So you just have a gunfight, typical action movie stuff. Then it ramps up to Hong Kong movie stuff, because then you get the martial arts stuff. Then it ramps up because you get into the mystical elements.
Yeah.
The three storms come down and do their thing. Yep. And then finally you have, like at the end, you have Lopan, who he drives over with his truck, and the guy survives. So that scene right there sort of encapsulates what the movie is and what Jack Burton is in the context of the whole movie.
Yeah.
Where he's a little bit of a maybe less capable Mad Max character, actually. He just finds himself in a situation and I guess I better help. And Wang is the character who knows what's going on.
Right.
But in that scene, they're just watching it happen. So I think that that's really well done. It's a microcosm of what the movie is overall, and it sets up what those characters' roles are. Right. One is competent and knowledgeable, and one is less competent, has no fucking idea what's going on. And they set that up in that scene, and for that reason, that's another reason why I give this movie high regard in terms of its writing. So again, very high score for me. I'm going 9. Claude, go ahead and disagree.
Well, like you, I'm also scoring this movie higher than I scored Buckaroo Banzai. Half a point higher in terms of writing. I give Big Trouble in Little China a 5.5 for writing. I agree with everything you said. I just can't weigh it as heavily in terms of the overall picture of the movie and the story. Those are all great points, and I think all contribute to why I like this movie a little more than Buckaroo Banzai, personally. Because this is no less ambitious, no less convoluted in terms of all the things that are happening. But I do think that the approach to all of that in this movie, I guess I want to say is handled better, but it probably just appeals to me more. I think
that ties into like the visuals too, like this,
yes,
the achievement.
Yep.
It just makes it more fun to look at.
Yeah, I mean, because this is recognizably Wizard of Oz, recognizably
yes.
Star Wars, recognizably The Hidden Fortress. You know, those journey movies. Game of Death, the Bruce Lee movie, where they're literally going up the levels in a temple. They're basically doing that here, and ironically, I think you mentioned earlier that it's kind of like a video game in that regard, which
underwater level that nobody likes. What they said, yeah.
And one of actually the very first video game I ever got for the Nintendo back in the day, the 8-bit Nintendo, was Kung Fu, which is a ripoff of Game of Death, and it's just exactly this structure. So it feels very familiarly video gamey to me. And you know, I can recognize, I guess, patterns and find the appeal more. But I will say that for all of the interesting features of the story and the way it's laid out here, I still think that it could have been tighter. It could have been less samey in certain parts, less meandery. I guess I wanted it to be more direct. And again, that's just my brain probably looking for patterns. But once we get into the sewers, as much as those those sets and the design of them are impressive, they start to feel like, oh my god, we're still in the sewers? We came in like 4 freaking scenes ago. Now it's a sewer with the pink light instead of the green light.
I don't feel like that.
And that sounds more visual, but I think that obviously the story is keeping them there.
Yes.
I just feel like it takes a long time to get to, Lopan's actual chamber, room of heroin. No, that sounds like the drug. Room of storage for the damsels, whatever you want to call that. So yeah, I mean, I guess 5.5 is probably harsh, and it felt right while watching it, so I'm gonna stick with it.
All right, fair enough.
I think there's, again, it's just below good. It's right under the line, and it is good. I still say it's good, but I just can't weigh it much higher because for me, I just want it to do things that it's not doing story wise.
All right, fair enough. All right, so that's those are our writing scores. We're going to go into audio now to finish up for round number 4, and this time Claude is first up.
Well, once we get to this audio round, it seems we're not so different after all, you and I. For Buckaroo Banzai, I give the audio a 6. I think that the sound design was fine. I think that there's a lot of effects, there's a lot of otherworldliness that needs to be conveyed in audio form as well as visual. And I think that they did a good job there. I will say that in terms of score, I'm not left with much that makes an impression, but I'm also not left with much that makes a bad impression. Song-wise, soundtrack-wise, I guess, the song at the end of the movie is a huge, lasting impression. And it's very entertaining. And it's very infectious. So, I give it high marks for that, too. I think that takes it from maybe something that was kind of like below average to good. Because it's not just a piece of music over the credits as a lot of movies do. This has become a thing.
Yes.
And, I think that it helps it become more memorable that way. And that's probably, I don't know if it's where they've applied the most creativity for this film, but I think it is the most unique use of it between these 2 movies and between a lot of other movies as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm going to go with 6 for the audio for Buckaroo Banzai.
Fair enough. As you mentioned, our scores are pretty close in this category. I'm going 6.5, just a little bit, half point above good. But my reasons are all very similar to yours. It's just kind of mostly competent. I do like that there's just enough variety, but apparently not too much variety for you.
Yeah, right.
I mean, because there is the score, and as you said, it's not very memorable. It's there. It's not antagonistic in any way. It's not grating in any way. It serves its purpose. There's also the soundtrack, and there's also sort of like an in-movie, in-universe musical element. Because again, Buckaroo Banzai is also a rock star, and he's part of the band Buckaroo Banzai and the Hong Kong Cavaliers. And there's a whole scene where they're playing their sort of rockabilly thing at this club. Yeah. And so it just kind of adds a little bit, that final credit sequence with the song, but that also ties into like that sort of a visual filmmaking choice. But you're right, that also makes it memorable.
Yep.
And then finally, as you said, there are special effects shots in this movie that require special effects sound, and that's also well handled, if not very memorable.
Sure.
It didn't sound like they were pulling stuff out of, the sound effects bank,
library of standard,
Right, it wasn't like Rocket Sound number 3, Right. I mean, it sounded like it, they didn't pull it out of the Republic cereals from the 40s or anything like that. So,
I look for that a lot too.
There was at least one bullet sound effect in Big Trouble in Little China that sounded like the same bullet effect that's been around in movies since the 1950s. It was kind of like, that type of thing. But we'll get to the audio for that movie in a minute. My score, again, for Buckaroo Banzai, 6.5. very similar to yours and for very similar reasons. So I guess we should move on.
All right. Well, the audio for Big Trouble in Little China gets an 8 for me. Kind of, we're back up to the land of higher scores, I guess. I feel like everything that applies to Buckaroo Banzai applies to this film as well, but even more. I don't know if that's a result of John Carpenter's involvement in the music. He's as much as he's a very unique filmmaker, he's a very unique musical composer as well. Especially, you look back across his body of work. He doesn't seem to like to use standard time signatures, and he experiments from an audio standpoint as much as he does visually and from story. So I think that helps kick it up, because when that can all go very wrong easily, and when something like that goes wrong, it goes really wrong. But I think in this case it went really right. And of course it's very synthesizer heavy and very dated 80s, and boy do I love that.
Yeah.
So unfair high marks perhaps, but high marks nonetheless. I think the real edge for the audio in this, in terms of music anyway, comes from the score. I think the score itself providing a little bit more memorability in terms of theming for the characters. Of course, the Jack Burton theme, when he's introduced in the beginning of the movie, is, it's easy to have heard that without necessarily have seen the movie, or at least seen the whole movie, because I was familiar with that from just having been exposed to it in other ways. And I think that kind of carries throughout. I think the musical cues and things are much more defined from a character perspective. So, for all those reasons, I kick the audio up to an 8 for Big Trouble in Little China.
Well, I agree. I'm going 8 for...
son of a bitch.
I am going... Oh, yeah, we should have... We should have done it like that. I am going 8 as well for audio for Big Trouble in Little China for all the reasons that you said. You have... if you want to hear John Carpenter's movie scores, you just have to watch John Carpenter movies.
Right.
Because he does the music for all of them. He continues to do a lot of the Halloween music, even though he's not directing those or writing those these days. He's still very active in that way. Yeah, he is a very unique composer. It is, in some ways, yes, it's a lot of synthesizer-y, keyboardy type stuff, and I think there was a time where that was forward thinking,
right,
and then it became more typical. And now he's still doing that when it's less typical. So he's kind of like, he's been doing it for this amount of time. And like the time where it was actually fashionable, kind of like he just passed right through that.
Yeah.
So I agree. Like, I like those kind of scores too. Like one of my favorite movie scores of all time is Tron Legacy. And Daft Punk did the score for that.
Right.
And it's a lot of similar type of thing. They do a lot of synthesizer-y stuff. I shouldn't be talking about a movie that's outside of the bounds of what we're talking about here, but it's just an example that I do also appreciate that. And I do think, and I do agree with you about the theming of it kind of sets the scene for different things in a more memorable way than something like Buckaroo Banzai does. Or Buckaroo Banzai has not its theme, but its sort of musical style, and that carries over. Buckaroo Banzai, the movie, does 20 different things, but the music is kind of what it is.
Right.
Except for those little moments where it's like, now we're going to watch his band play.
Yeah.
But this movie kind of sets up different things for different parts of the movie. There's like the action where like the rhythm is picking up because there's going to be action, and then but it also sets the tone for characters and such and things like that at different times throughout the movie. So again, I think it's a more
maybe.
Yeah. It sets that up too. Yes, I don't disagree. Overall, a little bit higher score. Well, actually, quite a bit higher score in terms of audio than I gave Buckaroo Banzai. Again, I'm going 8, same score as Claude. All right. That is 4 sets of scores. Now, we're going to take a break. We're going to do some math. Then we're going to come back and find out who the winner is. All right, we're back. Scores have been tabulated, and we have a winner. First up, we'll give you the score for The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the 8th Dimension. And that score is a very respectable 6.82.
Not too bad.
Not too bad. But The winner today with a score of 8. Very good score, as a matter of fact. Big Trouble in Little China. Any first thoughts on this?
Well, as you might notice, I too now am wearing some sort of jacket because, much like our winning movie, this review is going to ramp up as we go along. This happens to reflect my personal feelings very well about each movie, and they're both did fairly well, and they both, I think, deserve it in terms of, again, their long-term impact on culture and creativity.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think 8 is a very, very fair score for Big Trouble. 6.82, probably a little bit lower than I would go for Buckaroo Banzai on an overall score. The average of my scores is a lot higher than that, but when you take a step back from individual categories and look at a movie overall, you'll sometimes have an opinion that differs from what the pieces of those things would add up to. Kind of a whole being different than the sum of its parts type of thing.
Right.
And also, if you put a single score on a movie, you might not be breaking it down as much. So my initial instinct might be a little higher for Buckaroo Banzai, but it's probably a pretty fair score, 6.82. So I know I kind of messed around about us disagreeing, but I don't actually disagree with what the final results are here. So, well, that's it for this episode of Nerd Bomber vs. Movies. You can find us on YouTube. You must have already since you're somehow watching this. There is an Instagram page. It's at NerdBomberPod, and that is the best place to go to find links to the things we do. So, for your friend Claude, I've been just Jamie, and until the next battle,
aloha.
We really shook the pillars of heaven, didn't we, Wang?
No horseshit, Jack.
No horseshit.